Okay, so the PC version of Deus Ex The Fall is a port of a sequel to a book that's a prequel to the prequel of the original Deus Ex. Yeah, it's not confusing at all. Nah. Okay, let's try that again. The Fall started life as a game for iOS and Android devices, before eventually being ported to the PC, and was a follow-up to a novel, The Icarus Effect, that was set before Deus Ex Human Revolution, which itself was a prequel to the original Deus Ex. Okay, no matter which way you put it, that's pretty complicated. Ultimately, all you really need to know is that this game is set before Human Revolution, although it really does help if you've read the novel I mentioned, The Icarus Effect, because the game doesn't do a very good job of explaining who the characters carried over from it are, or why we should care about them. This is but one of many problems the game has, and while a lot of these problems can be overlooked, there are some which simply cannot, and it's those problems that cause the game to be immensely frustrating for both existing fans of the franchise and newcomers alike. Most of the more forgivable issues stem from the game being designed for mobile devices. The small levels and low-quality character models, for example, are forgivable once you remember the game's origins, as is the length of the whole thing. It ends rather frustratingly after the first chapter, right as you're getting into it, meaning that it's possible to blitz through the entire game in about an hour. And the poor voice acting can just be chalked up to tradition, because the franchise has never been known for its stellar talent in the audio department. As for the plot, that's more of a mixed bag. The story being told is actually quite interesting, and if nothing else, it does a good job at actually getting me to be interested in the book that's following up, since it does briefly recap some of the more interesting parts in that story, although it does leave out an awful lot, so to get the full experience, I want to read that thing. The problem is, as interesting a story as the game has, it's not being told particularly well, with your investigation into getting a drug, leading to an alternate one that could be tainted, feeling very rushed and awkward, and with information often being repeated for very little reason. It feels very cobbled together and not properly planned out, which is a bit of a letdown considering it's a Deus Ex game. But this is far from the biggest problem the game has, which has got to be the combat, which is hilariously crippled in ways that beggar belief. For starters, there's the recoil on the guns, which isn't the game shaking the screen, as you'd expect from pretty much every other game ever, but instead takes the form of the screen zooming in and out briefly, twice in the case of the shotgun, in a fashion that renders most guns absolutely useless unless you upgrade the main character to negate the effect. There's also the fact that the guns themselves are rather inaccurate, and that to fire them in cover, you can't just pop out and quickly fire off a couple of shots. Tapping the fire button makes you fire exactly one shot before you duck back behind cover in a pre-animated animation clearly designed for touchscreen, hasn't been touched up at all for the PC version. As a result of these mechanics, you'll pretty much be forced to avoid guns entirely and use stealth to take out your opponents as much as possible. Basically, you'll be using takedowns an awful lot, because this will always take out an enemy, at which point their bodies will fade away a couple of seconds later, even if you only knock them unconscious. This makes stealth a lot easier than it has any right to be, and it also removes a lot of the strategic elements that were in previous other Deus Ex games, like having to hide bodies out of sight in order to avoid being detected. Coupled with this is the surprisingly poor AI that will often get stuck in cover or just end up facing completely the wrong direction, and an alarm system that will just let you hide an event for 30 seconds before enemies forget you were even there, no matter how many of their colleagues you've taken out, all of which makes for an extremely unsatisfying experience. Adding the icing to the cake is the port optimization for the PC. Sadly, something we've come to expect from ports, but even then, not on this level. The lack of graphics options is somewhat forgivable, given that the game was never going to look particularly stunning. The inability to rebind keyboard controls, however, is not forgivable. At all. It makes absolutely no sense, and given just how clunky and awkward some of the controls are, you really do have to wonder why they even bothered at all. In fact, I posit the only reason the Fall came to PC is to allow Square Enix to squeeze a few extra pennies out of the game by allowing more people to buy it. But ultimately, the lack of effort put into the port shows that they really shouldn't have bothered. This was clearly designed as a mobile game, and a mobile game it should have stayed, because on the PC, all it does is shine as a textbook example of how not to port games. It's far from the worst game I've ever played. I wouldn't have gone through it 3 times if it was that bad, but I can't really recommend it, even if you're a die-hard Deus Ex fan. It may be a budget price, especially when it goes on sale, but even so, there's still far better games to spend your money on, something I would highly recommend that you do.